On today's podcast, we dive into the journey of John Reikes. He has helped scale companies, lead global teams, and turned around failing businesses into successful exits. He has even been part of a band that got play on the radio. Listen and learn how to lead with empathy, build a culture of trust and transparency, and why the software developer mindset is John's most important trait for success. Welcome to PossibLaw. I'm Sal Carranza. I'm a former lawyer, hence PossibLaw. I believe developing an entrepreneurial mindset is the cheat code to success and the future of knowledge work in the age of AI. Through our guest journeys, we will learn how to succeed in any project, company, and role, and build the skills required to leverage technology in an augmented world. Not a lawyer? Don't worry. If a former lawyer like me can figure it out, you can too. Let's get into it. John Reikes is an entrepreneur and former CEO of a visual legal strategy firm. He has a unique career journey that stretches from software development to legal and executive leadership. I'm excited for our conversation today. Welcome, John.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, this is kind of a business podcast, a little bit of a journey podcast. We're going to learn and we'll get into all that today. But I really like talking to people about who they are beyond their profession. So I like to start these to let the audience get to know you a little bit by just asking you, what do you like to do in your free time?
Well, I've got a 6-year-old and a 10-year-old, so there's not a whole lot of free time if you count outside of kids' activities. But no, I think as you become a parent, those sort of become what you do in your free time, and so certainly that's most of it. I've always been a little bit addicted to getting to the gym, and so every day there's a workout and kind of clears my head and puts me into a good space. It's my moment of zen. And then as the guitar is behind me, I actually haven't been playing much the last couple months, but that's always been sort of at least in the background as an adult. And I try to still play music as often as possible, and those are sort of the main drivers day to day.
Well, you were a musician. You didn't just like dabble in it, right? Like I learned how to play the guitar, and I mean, there's a guitar sitting in my office, but I don't like play it. You were a musician, right?
Yeah. So I played in a few bands over the years. Last band I played in was a band called The Thieves About that, we got played on the radio a little bit and, we started picking up steam at one point with, I can't remember if it was like in Germany, we started getting a whole bunch of streams or something like that, where we were like, we have no idea how this happened, but apparently there's a cluster of people who like us, and I might be getting the country wrong. I can't remember where it was, but, sort of toured around here, California and Arizona, not anything further than that though.
It's funny how that works. I feel like there's all these bands that they never really made it huge except in like one country. David Hasselhoff in Germany.
Yeah.
Why? Who knows? But it's just like an interesting thing. It also talks to the sort of global nature of our world these days, where you can become famous in a random country halfway around the world
And not even know why.
and not have no idea. Right, exactly. I'm also always curious about band names. How did you come up with your band name?
That wasn't me. That was our singer who came up with it. His son got really into trains, and then they got into like learning about hobo culture in the old days of, these hobos riding on trains. And so they used to have like all these like symbols that they would paint on the train cars to sort of tell each other things about what was going to be going on. And one of the symbols was the number 2 over the number 10, which was to keep your 2 eyes on people's 10 fingers, because it meant there are thieves about. And for whatever reason, they liked that. And so that became the name of the band.
Like total randomness of how things come about. And it also goes to show you, no matter the time or place or what you do, there's always these frameworks that you have to follow to make sure you do well or stay alive. It's fascinating to me.
Yeah.
Okay. So musician, you still play. Let's talk a little bit about your journey, how you got where you got. Where did you go to college? What did you go to college for?
I grew up in Riverside, California. And while I was in high school, one of my best friend and I, we used to fix computers. His dad actually had a business fixing computers, and he'd bring home a whole bunch of computers in his trunk on the weekend, and we'd spend the whole weekend staying up late and getting them all ready. And then Monday morning he'd go and start driving them back. And both of us then, once we were old enough to drive, started going and fixing computers, for his overflow clients. And so I started off doing that, and I wanted to become a programmer. So I had, learned a little bit on my own, and I actually got into UCLA, into their computer science program, and went to orientation, and found out that I couldn't get a lot of my necessary classes because they were so overcrowded with computer science kids. This was the late 90s. I was a year ahead in school already, and so I was going to be starting undergrad in 97. And so they were packed. Dot-com boom was starting to take shape a little bit, on the horizon at that point. Yeah, so I found out it was going to be a minimum 5-year program, and I felt like, no, I need to be out in the workforce right now. I need to be able to get myself a Ferrari by my 25th birthday. So when I heard that, I had a freak out. And I had already taken some classes while I was in high school at UC Riverside. And so it was just a readmit. And I talked to the folks over there and found out it was only going to be 3 years to get my degree there. And so those 2 years made the decision for me that I decided to go to UC Riverside instead of UCLA.
Tell us about that decision. Seems like a big one.
A decision which I've lived to regret. And I'm not one of those people who says, oh, never have regret. No, sometimes you screw something up and you blow it, and you probably should have done the other thing. And this is one of those. I should have gone to UCLA. I should have taken 5 years, 6 years even would have been better. Because what ultimately ended up happening was, first off, I went to undergrad in the same town that I grew up in. So I sort of missed out on that life experience. But I also rushed through it so fast that I didn't have the experience that most people have of going away to college and sort of growing into an adult. And so I think I graduated in 3 years. I was 20 years old. I wasn't even old enough to go to a bar to celebrate my own graduation. And I looked like I was about 15. So that didn't exactly help in the job market that, they're like, who is this little kid who's coming in here trying to get a job? Yeah, it just, and also the dot-com bust happened right as I finished school. So there also weren't any great jobs for programmers. And along the way, I ended up even stopping the computer science program because I wanted to get out of school so quickly that I saw the faster route was going to be an econ degree. And it freed me up that I had more time in my spare time to do programming jobs. So I was doing all this side work as, I was doing like web app development, and I got into PHP. And anyway, all of that was, just kind of bad timing. And probably would have been better to have been at UCLA for 5 years and just stuck to that computer science degree, but so be it. So I got out of school. I was a programmer for a couple of years, and the economy for programmers wasn't great because of the dot-com bust. And I was very interested in business, didn't really understand much of anything about how businesses worked, and but wanted to know. So I took the GMAT. I was applying to business schools. I had gotten acceptance letters already, some scholarship offers, but there was, we'll call it extremely heavy parental persuasion, probably more like coercion, is appropriate, to go to law school because, according to my mom, you can do anything with a law degree. And that, everything you're going to learn in business school, you'll learn in law school plus more, which is not at all true. And, again, that's kind of my second real big regret was taking that advice, because I really didn't have any interest in law. I mean, like none. I wasn't somebody who watched Matlock and Law, or Law and Order or anything else and thought, oh, how cool to go into court. Well, I didn't want to. But what I did see was that there did seem to be new applications of technology happening in law, and that somehow that probably would turn into a path. And that part was correct, that there were things happening with technology and law that did turn into a path. You fast forward, it's been over 20 years since, or this year will be 20 years. My God, in 2 months here, it's going to be my 20 years since graduating from law school.
Well, after graduating, you went and did civil litigation, but then you did find an opportunity to get into that technology that you just mentioned, right?
I found an opportunity with a company called Onsite that did e-discovery. Their biggest customer was a large financial institution who their project manager was quitting, and they wanted a lawyer to be their project manager. So, I was a lawyer who wanted to do this. They needed a lawyer. We came to a good agreement. It was actually considerably more money than I had been making as a lawyer at that point. And so I took the leap. I was very scared that I felt like, once you leave practice, you're not going to go back, which was true, but also a good thing in my case. Now, that was 2008, and that financial institution was one of the first ones to collapse during the great 2008 recession. So our company was so dependent on that revenue that we went bankrupt not long after me joining. And so it was just kind of like it was a very sudden crash course in the reality of the business world that I had so wanted to learn about, and welcome to it. You get to learn about it. So we had a Chapter 11 bankruptcy, and we got acquired out of it by a company called Integrion, which CEO was Liam Brown, who we both know. And so our head of sales kind of came to me at one point a few months later. I remember this call where he called me up and he says, well, you could keep on, being a senior project manager, but there's not a lot of projects to manage. You seem to have some good relationships with clients. We could move you into a sales role and have you develop some new business. And it was pretty clear what I was being told, that, if you don't want to be a salesperson, you're likely going to lose your job. Otherwise, guess what? You're now a salesperson. So sort of accidentally, I found myself as a salesperson. And, that wasn't a terrible time to be in that kind of a job. And it went okay there. And I later switched over to Kroll OnTrack, which was kind of the gold standard name in that space. And so there were a bunch of us that came on board, but it was a great team. And we actually, we really did pretty well over a couple of years there that enabled a really good exit for, the investors on that round. And that was actually where I first came across Mark Williams, who's now the CEO of Magna. He and I worked together when I was at Kroll, and he put me into a product leadership role. So that was kind of my first then move closer to where I wanted to be, getting away from no longer having to be a lawyer and no longer selling, because, I did all right with it, but it wasn't something I had ever really aspired to be. And so he put some trust in me, and it went well. We came up with a managed services offering that was, we didn't have a lot of money to invest in it, or basically none. It was mostly a different way of going to market. And instead of, at the time, going back to this like disconnect that you can have between the value that's perceived and the price that you're getting, everything was based on a per gigabyte cost. And yet gigabytes were like the most insignificant part of our cost basis. So I had this concept that let's move gigabytes to an extremely small cost, but the starting point, so you had this like cost floor that was quite high, and then above that you want to put a whole bunch of terabytes into our system. It didn't really matter to us, and that was really disruptive. So it was of interest to a lot of our clients, and yeah, pretty quickly everybody started to want to sign on, and then we sold.
Well, then you got the software developer bug again, right? And that's when you did your startup?
I left not too long after the sale, as did many of my other colleagues, and for a little bit of time was working on my startup that we talked about, which was I had started on this a little bit while I was still at Kroll, and then really kind of went into high gear with it. I built out a crowdsourced video platform, and I think it was called Camera Flock. And basically what it did was it let people at an event all, just start to stream something, live stream. And with this, it was sort of more focused on what are the events. And so you might say, hey, there's this band that's playing down the street and I can't make it out there, but I wanted to see it. And so you could search by geography or by event, and everyone who was there and started to stream, it would identify, hey, you seem to be at this event. Is that correct? Yes, join. And then it would create a multi-camera feed where it would switch automatically from, camera 1 to camera 4, down to camera 3, for a bit. And it felt much more like a TV broadcast. So from a tech standpoint, it was a pretty major challenge. I made a strategic mistake here where I could do a lot of the lifting myself, and we built it and it worked. And then I started trying to raise money, and that was a huge mistake. You can't build something that far along that you're basically ready to go to market, and then for the first time raise your hand to investors and say, you should invest in me, because they all kind of scratch their head and go, what are you talking about? Who are you? You have no investment, and then you don't have a product. And it's like, no, we have a product. No, you don't. And so I had this like 60-second video that I remembered sending around to everybody on Sand Hill Road. And I think, I can't remember if it was 0 or like 1 or 2 people who ever clicked on that link. And interestingly, it was just a couple of the really, really big tech companies who took interest. And ultimately, I didn't get any of those deals together. And that was it. It was costing me money to keep the Amazon environment alive. And so, the costs were getting to the point where, with a young family and everything else, I had to cut bait. And that was it was a really painful blow. But I think it was a really, really valuable learning experience, that having a good idea is, who cares, and there's so much more to the execution. There's so much more to the process, to making sure that you are developing a story, but also get into a business where you have some connections Because if you don't know anybody, it's going to be really hard to get in front of the people you need to get in front of and get them to take you seriously. And, you and I have had lots of conversations about lots of businesses, and on quite a few of those, I was convinced those were great ideas and that, we weren't going to be the people to make it happen.
Well, we both know that sometimes things just don't work out. And as long as you learn, there are no failures. And that's how you ended up at the next thing, right?
So yeah, after that, I eventually ended up at Elevate and ran the discovery and doc review business there, that's where we first got to know each other. And that was a very small business unit, grew at about 10x in 2.5 years, and top line revenue wise, run rate. And it turned into a good profit center for the business. And that was a big win. And it ultimately opened the door to high impact, where I was most recently. And I got the CEO role, came to my desk, and I have zero regrets on that one. That was a great group of people to work with, both the investor team and the team of folks who worked at High Impact. I really enjoyed all of that. It was a turnaround. The company was in a pretty bad spot when I came on board. A lot of folks had basically written off the investment, or pretty much everyone, it seems, had written it off. And we got them back to a pretty decent return on their initial investment. So I was there for 3 years before we sold to a competitor and had that exit for everybody. So I think one of the things that really came into focus during that time was the importance of working with people who you really like working with.
There's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah.
I think there's a couple threads in there that I want to touch on, which I think are relevant to how you got here. The first being something that I stress a lot is being both curious and adaptable. And I heard that throughout. Maybe you should have gone to business school, you went to law school, but you were curious about what the opportunities were, and then you were adaptable.
Yeah.
You were successful in, managed services, but instead of just sticking there, you thought, well, I have this other idea. I'm going to be curious about this opportunity and adaptable in how I go about it. How did you gain that mentality? Is that something your parents taught you? Is that something a professor? Where did that come from?
I don't know. I think I've just always, from like a really young age, I'd get curious about something and needed to know all the details. It wasn't good enough to like know a little bit about it. I had to know everything. There was like a phase when I was a little kid, I got really into lizards, and man, did I talk my parents' ears off way too much about lizards for a while, And I just think that's kind of always been me. Now I'll say it's both a good thing and a bad thing. So like I have to know every detail, and it can be maddening and it can be off-putting. So I try to sort of keep the reins on it a little bit, but it's honestly just sort of hardwired. Yeah, my wife laughs at me for it.
Obviously, I'm similar. I mean, I'm literally talking to you for I don't know how long now because like I'm always interested and I do the same thing. I do think it's a skill that's really beneficial, especially if you're an entrepreneur, because you kind of look at the world a little differently because you're listening and then your mind starts clicking, I wonder if I could do that thing or that thing. And you start asking questions and you see opportunities where a lot of other people don't. It leads into another thing that I heard from sort of the journey as to where you got was you're somebody who does, you don't just talk about it. And I think that's really important for a really significant reason. I'm a big believer, it's not just me. I think Bezos is probably the most famous who talks about like creating a culture of being able to fail. But if you don't act, you don't learn. And learning comes from failure more often than from success. And so I'm curious how you have learned to take some of the hits that you've taken, but still be able to get back up and move forward with the next thing.
I think it goes back to, look, some of my earlier endeavors just weren't that successful. And so there was a little bit of get accustomed to it and, be real about it. And, don't be afraid to say to people, so, that thing I thought was a great idea, it turns out it wasn't. Sorry. Here's where it's going right now. Let's talk about what to do next. I will say, I think I'm better at this when I'm working for somebody else than I am when it's my own entrepreneurial ventures. I am too risk averse with my own stuff. And I say this despite the fact, as we talked about the other day, actually, outside of this podcast, I've got a business that I'm starting up right now. And I think one of my friends in particular was very surprised to hear that we were actually going to do it because he's like, yeah, you're going to talk about it and it's all going to pencil out and it's going to be great. And then you're going to chicken out and not do it. And And so he was surprised that I'm doing it. And he's right to have made that criticism that when it comes to a really big risk like starting a new business, I usually identify it, do all the analysis, and then if there's any risk at all, I can be a bit of a chicken. I think when it comes to the roles that I've had leading businesses for investors or for other people, I'm a little more likely to do that same risk assessment and present and say, listen, math puts it at a 75% chance of success. Here's the outcome at that. 15% chance of not really a success, but not a huge failure. And then, we've got about a 10% chance that this is disastrous. But, math says we should probably do it. So let's do it. And hopefully we end up in the 75% or at least the 15% buckets that we've analyzed. So I'm better. I think I'm better at that with other people. And that's an area for growth for me because that's always what you should do. This is a classic thing. I made a reference to casinos earlier. Look, if you've got a big bet on the table and the dealer deals you 11 and has a 5 showing, even if you don't feel that comfortable, you're supposed to double down. That is what the math says, even if it feels really, really uncomfortable. Yeah.
I think that's an important point, though, I think for our audience to remember is whether you're an entrepreneur now, you're a startup founder, you're a professional, right? Whatever it might be. There's a couple things I always like to remind people, which is one, entrepreneurship, the startup founder game isn't for everybody. It is incredibly, you need a lot of risk tolerance or just plain out irrational confidence is maybe a better way to say it, because you can do all the math. And at the end of the day, even if the math's out,
yeah,
you still need to jump. And that's hard for most people. And I think a lot of people get caught up in I can't do that. I could never do that. I'm not as good as them. It's just a different skill. It's just a different skill and it's a different mentality. But I think it is important for people to remember that you still follow a path. You follow a process. And so whether you're like you were dealing with other people's companies and making decisions and maybe more risk tolerance, more risk tolerance there because it wasn't your hard-earned money, you were still following a process and it's no different.
Yeah. And I don't even know that it's the difference of when it's my hard-earned money versus the difference between there's a different emotional blow when you start something and it fails. That is your sense of self that really takes a hit. And I know that from when Camera Flock didn't work out. That was emotionally awful. That was really, really a painful thing because it wasn't just I've lost some money and some time. It was I was sure this was a good idea. And anytime you start a business, you're going to have friends and family who cheer you on, but secretly think, "Oh, you're crazy. This is never going to work." That is what they're thinking.
Everybody, literally everybody.
You'll sense it, and everyone will say, "No, I really believe in you." No, they don't. They think you're crazy, and this is that's fine. They're able to think that, but then there's this like shame of they were all right and I was dumb to think otherwise. And that's not a productive way to think about it, but that is the reality. That's a natural human way to reflect on a failure like that. And it's different from, I came to the board, I advised them that we had a 10% chance that this was going to go very badly. These were the things outside of our control or knowledge that could lead to that. Those are the things that happened. We mitigated the downside. I can feel okay with that, that it was a group decision. But when you're starting something, especially by yourself, it's all on you, and no one's going to look at the financials. Nobody has that kind of nobody saw the deck in advance and sees the things that went wrong. You just kind of know that everybody thought you were crazy, and then they're going to look at it and go, "Well, yeah, of course it failed." And so there's this like horrible embarrassment associated with that. And I think that is something you have to come to terms with if you're going to go that path. That you're going to have to be able to stand up tall and say, "This is what I'm doing," and accept that that's you're gonna hear exactly what I said. That people will say, "Oh, I'm so proud of you. That's great," whatever. And then that all the conversations your family's going to be saying, what's going to happen? Be out of a job. This is never going to work. And so you need to have enough conviction in what you're doing. But also, just like any other business decision, you have to assess those risks and be cognizant of it and try to place the bets where you think it's got the highest likelihood of success.
Yeah, and it goes back to the doing versus the talking about doing. I think there's, whether you're making a decision to augment your team with technology or make a bet on a product you're going to come out, or foundationally building a company, you have to act. And I think too many people get caught up in the analysis, the paralysis analysis. Well, I don't know. The math says it. It doesn't say it. That person didn't like it. Maybe if I ask these 12 people and they say it's okay, then it's okay. And that's not to say that you shouldn't listen to others. You can get caught up in your own little bubble of reality, but sometimes you just have to go act. And as long as you take learnings from that action, I think it's really important. You know, as you know, right? I spent the last 8 months trying to build this idea, and it didn't go the way I hoped. But something that really helped me was just taking a little bit of time to process it. What did I learn from it? What can I take from it? What can I move forward with? And then come out the other side. And so for me, all failure is just an opportunity to learn. Actually, going back to the toddlers, right? Or the kids, teaching them that idea is really important. I know the kid thing can be difficult. I have one. I know lots of people do. Has having kids changed how you interact with your profession at all?
Oh,
Is
massively.
it harder? Yes.
Massively. Yeah. You know, I think so. I'll tell you, when we talked about this before, that at one point I actually tried to get a real startup, like a tech startup, off the ground, and it ultimately didn't happen. And one of the things that I think I sensed, at least from potential investors, was that there was a little bit of apprehension to invest in a startup run by somebody who had a little kid. My daughter had just been born when I was trying to get that off the ground. And I think that people sort of expect that you're going to have distractions from that, which that's not untrue. You do. But I think it changes your priorities in other ways that can be positive. So on the one hand, you have less time to devote if you're going to still be balancing that, but you have greater financial pressure. Having kids is really expensive. You know, childcare is crushingly expensive, and just everything else that goes along with it. And so you start to get to this point where you really need to just learn to be efficient with your time and your energy. You need to figure out, I know my employer needs me to move the needle, and they, look, if you're a lawyer and you're counting hours, then that simply means put more hours in. But outside of, an hourly profession, there usually are KPIs that you can sort of keep your eye on and say, I'm not going to solve these problems by throwing unlimited hours at it as a parent. Or if I am, I'm going to suffer at home. I'm not going to be the parent that I want to be. And so I need to be efficient. I need to be focused on those KPIs. I need to be thinking about them at all times and make sure I'm moving those balls forward, as efficiently and effectively as possible.
Do you think that having kids actually gives you a little bit of a superpower in work that you might not other have? I've always thought that, yes, I agree that, like, if you have kids, that means you can't put in the 80-hour weeks into your startup because some of that time goes to your kid. Although I think lots of famous founders have said they regret that because they didn't have any connection with their kid for that exact reason. Right. That's beside the point. But I've also found that it has given me a lot more patience and almost foresight in how I interact with teams, because it's forced me to think about more than myself in a lot of ways. Has that helped you at all?
I think so. And I think there are things about being a good manager that aren't that different from being a good parent, where I think when you're young and inexperienced, you kind of figure, oh, when you're the boss, you just tell people what to do. And people don't have to do exactly what you tell them to do. They don't. And neither do kids, So you kind of see, like, if you're 20 and you don't have any kids and you're at a restaurant on a date and somebody's got a kid that's like flipping out a table over, you might feel a little bit annoyed and say, oh, why don't they just tell the kid to stop? And it's like, oh, you think that's the solution? Let's try that out and see how it goes. I don't think that's not gonna get you there. And similarly, people say, oh, your workforce isn't productive enough. Why don't you just tell them to work harder? Yeah, I hadn't thought of that one. That's a great idea. So, there's some similarities there of learning that you might kind of be the boss, but you're never totally somebody's boss. You always have to be reasonable with them and meet them in the middle and be meeting their needs if you want them to meet your needs. And so I think that comes through with, look, we all have our days where we're better parents and days where we're worse parents. And the days where I bark orders at my kids, let me tell you, those days don't go well. And the same thing happens at work. If you're barking orders at people, that might have felt satisfying in the moment, but let me tell you, those are not the things that are going to really get done effectively. Whereas when you really communicate the importance of something and why it's happening, and you make sure that you're aligning both sides' needs, that's where everyone comes together.
My daughter is 4.5, and she's 100% going through that. Want to be independent, want to do things on her own, want to learn against all the emotions that come with kind of being a girl and growing and all that stuff. And I talk to her a lot about the skill that she needs to remember. She comes out of this is something that so many adults still don't have, which is that emotions are good. Frustration, anger, happiness, whatever it might be. But how you manage those emotions and show them to the world is actually a huge determinating factor of how well you do in society, quite frankly.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that's an interesting thing, that if you haven't had kids, it's not that you can't do that well. Obviously you can, but it's so upfront reminder, right? Because you see it in your kids. It's the thing you said about the restaurant, right? Is like somebody walks up to you, it happens all the time. Can you tell your kid to stop yelling? Yeah, I've tried that. And
Why didn't I think of that?
I don't know. But the thing is, like, I've learned to remember, because I also get frustrated like any human, man. Can you please stop? But they don't know yet how to kind of manage that emotion. And so breath work and pausing and talking about what you're feeling, all those kinds of things. It's an interesting thing I have learned. It's actually improved my own ability to manage my emotions and work with others, and also recognize in a team, whether somebody's reporting to me or I'm reporting to somebody else, you can kind of see the cues of, okay, maybe they're having a moment here. And so I think it's an important thing to remember.
It really is. And I think that it's funny that you've brought this up in the context of having kids versus at work, because we all have emotions and needs, and we all, regardless of age and experience and everything else, we all act out to varying degrees based on those things, and those interpersonal dynamics and those feelings are hugely impactful to what happens in a company. And there's a big difference between somebody who's working a lot of hours and is enjoying their work and feels supported and heard, and somebody who doesn't. So, yeah.
It's one of those common sense does to some extent, except you forget about it. There's endless research that shows that people who feel heard, happier in their job, just do better work. And that seems sort of obvious. And yet too often managers, business owners, they get in this, you're replaceable. Do what I say or you lose your job, instead of thinking through the ramifications of how they interact with their teams and their employees. And that comes back to emotional control and good sort of interpersonal skills. And it is sort of obvious. And yet here we are in 2025 and it still happens all the time.
Look, if you treat your team as fungible, they will treat their job as fungible. And I think it's important not just to make people feel heard, but do listen. I mean, I don't care how creative or smart or whatever else you are and how well you know an industry. We all have our blind spots. And the funny thing about blind spots is they're usually not where you thought they were going to be. And you might have to listen to 10 ideas to hear one good one that actually matters, but you'll hear stuff that will matter and that will change things. And I've always found it's important to just to listen to people and to be upfront about, hear what you're saying. I get why you think that's the way. I'm going to decide against it for the following reasons, and I might be wrong. But this is why I think this is the right choice to make. And and then afterwards, if it turns out you were wrong, go back and let the person know. So remember that conversation we had? You were right. I was wrong. You just let people see that that's how this works, is we talk about it. Yes, if you're somebody's boss, it might be that, no, it's not a democracy where everyone's just going to vote on it and we do whatever the majority voted for. But, have that humility to come back and say, yeah, I was wrong on that one. And, you'll more likely get your way next time.
What you're talking about, from my perspective, is transparency, which is something that people mix up with control or the freedom to do whatever they want. And it's an interesting thing in companies, because I think too often managers, business owners, especially CEOs,
get trapped a little bit in this idea of being nice to their employees versus kind or how you interact with them. Because one of the things that I've learned that has really helped me is saying something like, look, you don't want to be the final arbiter. This decision has real ramifications. You frankly don't want them. And when people ask me like, well, what do you mean by that? I'm like, well, it's riding on revenue or the company. If it goes poorly, I have to go let that person go.
Right.
These are the kinds of ramifications that impact that. But when you give them transparency as to decision making, and I think something critical you said, which I really liked, which is acknowledging you don't know if it's right. And even more importantly, if you get it wrong, coming back and saying, I was wrong, but I made it my best decision.
Right.
That's why. How did you come about that skill set? Because I don't think that is something that's natural to everybody.
Yeah, I think that I had unrealistic expectations going into my career, which, long story on all of that. But and then I think quite a bit of letdown early on and frustration, and didn't really end up where I thought it was going to be as quickly as I thought I was going to be. And so, you get kicked enough times, and have sort of reality check you that, yeah, you're gonna learn some humility. And along with that, you know, countless times that I thought I had it all figured out and I absolutely didn't. And so there's kind of this like curse of early success that some people who just kind of hit it right and they have a really successful startup, or they start a business that goes well, they have a tendency to overestimate the degree to which their own actions gave rise to that, and that they have a tendency to think they are more deserving of it, and not realize that almost all success has an element of luck to it, and they sort of tend to downplay how much that might be. And I think in my case, I certainly had some swings and misses. I had some things that we've talked about before where it was all the right decisions, everything was right, and maybe a little bit of bad luck. And so having sort of had a couple of things not go as well as I wanted them to go, it gave me a lot of humility. It made me really learn. I think I'm a smart guy. I think I can, we've talked about this before. I can model out financials pretty well. And, I'm often going to be right on things like that, or much closer than maybe the average bear, but I'm still going to be wrong frequently. And so it's top of mind. And, there's a comment that I've made to a lot of people that if you think about business, we have this tendency to think that like a great leader is right 80-90% of the time. They have great judgment. That's not even close to correct. Casinos are built on being right 51% of the time. And I don't know if you've been to Vegas recently, but they're usually not sparing a lot of expense in those places. You really, that is the difference between success and failure. Is, are you right 51% of the time or 49% of the time? Get 60, 70, 80% out of your head. You're not right that often.
I think that also brings up a really important thing for entrepreneurs, professionals, that perspective is really important, right? If you are a 300 hitter, you hit the ball 3 times out of 10 in baseball.
Yeah.
You are a Hall of Famer, right?
Yep.
Like some of the best ever. And remembering that perspective is important. And it goes to the same in entrepreneurship and being a professional in general, which is, it's kind of the idea that Jordan always said is like, you don't get to be the guy who made the shot if you don't take the shot. You just have to learn and follow the process. And actually, that's why I like to talk so much about process and journey, because I think a lot of times people get caught up in the end state. Did it work? Did it not? Instead of, did I make good decisions along the way? Mm-hmm. How did you learn to take the patience to structure your decision making in a way that you thought gave yourself the best opportunity?
I'm a nerd. And so I think I look at everything a little bit through like a math lens. When I was a teenager, I started programming as a hobby, and you have to very quickly figure out, how do I turn the real world into math problems? Because that's kind of how you're, especially back then. Now with AI, it's a little bit different. How do I, turn input into output? And then that's different from how you used to have to code when it was all just straight logic. And so I think I started to really think a lot about, and it's not like I had a degree in statistics or anything, but you start to understand the core concepts of it, even if you have to use the built-in functions in the library for, how you actually do those calculations. And so you start to sort of notice, all right, well, I can't measure this particular thing that I see, but I can measure this thing, which is very similar and indicative of it, and is going to help me sort of get to roughly the right answer. And I can also measure this other thing, and the two of them together is going to get me an approximation that's roughly this good. So the more you sort of think about things in that way, the more you find you can apply that everywhere. That, like you said about batting averages, I think my sense is, that yeah, I can bat more than 51%, at business decisions. Well, that means that if I make 5 decisions, there's a good chance all 5 of them could be wrong. But if I make 100, there's a good chance I'm going to get at least half of them right. That's where it starts to follow the trend. Sometimes that's hard to remember in the moment if you've just had, some things where you had a swing and a miss. That having a bad day doesn't mean that you're necessarily any different from what you overall are. But you have to, like you said, you got to take those shots. You got to, swing the bat. You got to make decisions, and you have to go into them knowing that the math is that you'll have some streaks, you'll have some ups and downs and all of that, but overall it'll sort of even out. And you're not gonna bat 1,000, and you're not gonna bat 0.
I've also thought that creating a framework, Jeff Bezos has talked about this, others have talked about this, which is this idea that figure out which decisions really need your time. Like, which do you stress about? Which do you really work through versus which ones do you make based on your predefined mental model or whatever framework you're following that you can move through. And that's really helped me, because figuring out that, yes, this decision could end the company. Okay, probably should talk to some people, should take the night to think about it, versus the worst case scenario is we just start again. That is a helpful bar on evaluating. As you have gone through your career and made more difficult decisions, those decisions that really will impact long term, have you found that it's been helpful for you to create sort of a committee around you to help? Or is this something that's worked better for you to just internalize?
No, so I think one of the worst points I've had in my last couple years was when we were in the process of selling High Impact, and I wasn't able to talk to my team for several months. There was eventually our CFO was in the loop, but everybody else was not. And there were decisions being made that would have a real impact on the team. And I wanted everyone's input on those decisions and couldn't get it. And I found that, I don't even know if it's challenging, because there weren't necessarily, challenging is the wrong word, I should say, because it's not like we could necessarily change some of the things that we were going to do. There were investors involved. There were a lot of other factors here that we were probably still going to go down the same path. But I at least wanted to hear their thoughts. I wanted to sort of build some consensus around what do we do to sort of navigate this all together. And even within friend groups, I had to be pretty careful that I've got a lot of friends in the legal space who I couldn't talk too much about what was going on. And so, I'm fortunate that my wife, Sarah, is a very sophisticated person. And so I can talk to her about these things. But it was a little bit of a vacuum, that it was really me and her. And, I also had great investors to work with there. So we had a more open and comfortable sort of a cadence than I think a lot of people have with their investors. And they were genuinely caring individuals. They wanted the best for the team. And so we also were able to have some of those conversations. But I guess what I'm getting at is I had to shut down a little bit of my normal committee. And my style has been that I, even when it's something that doesn't necessarily need a whole lot of people's input, I usually on our weekly catch-ups would say, hey, by the way, we need to do this thing. I was thinking this, just any issue with that? No? Okay, great. Let's move on. And once in a while, somebody says, no, there's an issue. It's this. And you go, oh, I thought that was a really easy decision. And I'm really glad that I mentioned it.
I think that's a good point you make, because what you perceive as maybe an insignificant decision with asymmetric information might actually be a really significant decision.
Absolutely.
And So including your team in the choices you're making, even if they're small, just as like an update. Hey, I think I'm going to do this. Anybody have any comments there? It can be really helpful. I also think it creates the kind of environment that is really beneficial for a company to thrive, in the sense that if your team, whether it's senior leadership or all the way down at the bottom of the first person coming in the door, feels comfortable coming to you with you ideas or issues, being the person that fixes the problems isn't always fun, but at least it's coming to you, has a lot of benefit, because most of my experience in success has come from information. If you don't have that data, you're just kind of flying through the dark. So creating an environment and a culture that gets you there is really important. And so I'm just curious, how have you gone about building, creating culture within your companies, within your teams, to get that really key information for you to make good decisions?
If you want to continue building your entrepreneurial mindset and enjoy our content, we would love for you to subscribe, hit the bell, follow along. You can also find us on our Substack, PossibLaw.
I mean, I think it's that it goes back to some of what we talked about before with, making sure you're not just making people feel heard, but actually listening and hearing them. And I think that the teams that I've worked with see pretty quickly that their input does matter, and that I'm listening, or at least I hope they're coming away with that. I think they come away with that impression. And so, I'm not just asking them to make them feel good. I am really soliciting that feedback, and they see that impact. And so that kind of builds that trust, that they see they are part of the process, that and when I don't do what they've suggested, I'm usually very transparent about why. I talk about financials with my teams more than I think they're usually accustomed to, because those, obviously, if you're running a company, especially an investor-backed company, you have numbers to deliver. Your investors are not investing their dollars in a business that they don't operate because it's fun to throw money at something that they're not even in the operation. They're doing it to make money, and there are other investments that they can make money at. So you need to be performing, or they're going to want to bail, and there will be repercussions. So keeping everybody sort of aligned to that, and sort of realistic about, if this was your money, how would you feel? How would you feel if maybe you have a smaller investment to make? Let's say you put $1,000 into something, and now you're checking the stock price and it's 500. Do you think you're going to feel real good about that? Especially if your buddies told you to invest in something else that's now quadrupled in price. I think getting people around to that, and making sure they understand how that is impacting those decisions on the ground in the real world, and that's not because investors are some like greedy group of horrible people, but because they're just real people who are risking their money and need that to go as well as possible. It helps. I think one other thing, just kind of going back to, I made some comments before about how my first career as a programmer sort of influences how I view a lot of things, that I tend to be pretty quantitative about how I assess things, and I look for, where might there be correlations, where might there be indicators of things. We talked a bit about that in terms of how to make decisions, but I think something I forgot to mention before is the importance of then looking back at all of those decisions with a skeptical eye, and knowing, I like to tell people, I make mistakes all the time. And I know I make mistakes all the time. So when we make a decision, especially one where I'm not that sure that it's the right one, what I like to start doing is collecting data as quickly as possible to check, was this the right decision? And if it starts to look like it wasn't, start thinking about a new strategy. Can you back out of the investment that you've made? Can you change course on this? If you can't change course easily, what can you do to mitigate the damage from this bad decision? Because those things do happen. And the earlier you come to terms with that, the better you're going to be able to get the ship back on course.
I think it's an interesting point you make. It's something you and I have talked about. If you're a lawyer and you've had some seemingly success, it was always funny to me, right? Kind of like what society thinks of the role gives lawyers sometimes more cachet in the decisions they're making. Well, it's because of that. When in fact, I think it ends up being kind of a hindrance sometimes. And I'll explain that in the context of, lawyers tend to look at things retroactively and try to solve for precedents, like how are we going to prove that thing and do it again or fix that thing, instead of a mentality of we're trying to solve for growth or we're trying to get somewhere we're going. Law firms are notorious for this. We could put that to the side for another day. But I think what's interesting thing you brought up is this idea of builder or software. You know, if I had taken your words and put in them in code, what you were talking about is building something, going into your Git repository, figuring out the issues, working through it, and building again, right?
Running
And
tests, seeing if the tests come out with the output that you were expecting, and if not, that's an issue. Or maybe they came out right in your tests, but then you've got users saying, "Dude, this doesn't work at all," and then figuring out, "Oh, maybe my tests were wrong. Maybe I'm looking at the wrong."
I think that is part of where I've always been fascinated about kind of the builder mentality that comes from being a software developer. Has that really helped you in your roles as you've grown professionally and run larger and larger organizations?
I would actually say it's the most important part of what I've done. And interestingly, so as a lawyer, I still keep a license, even though I haven't practiced now in 15, almost 20 years, which I can't believe it's been that long. But um, I think people have a tendency to go, "Oh, you're a lawyer. Oh, wow." So I often make this joke about, there are two things you can do with a law degree. You can either practice law or spend the rest of your life answering questions about why you don't practice law. And and so, as soon as somebody hears that I went to law school, but I don't practice, the first thing they think is, "Oh, you never passed the bar." It's like, no, I passed the bar. I practiced. I didn't like it. They like can't. Their mind is blown. They can't comprehend. How could you not want to be a lawyer? And I'm like, well, have you ever been a lawyer? The only people who don't ask me why I'm not practicing law anymore are lawyers. And they immediately are like, "Oh, good for you," And so I think not only do people not understand why I'm not a lawyer, but then they think, well, that must be so helpful for work. And it's not really. I mean, yes, there are issues that come up. You've got, a disgruntled employee, and then you have to think about are they going to try and sue you for something? What are they going to sue you for? Are they going to have a case? Or, I mean, they don't even really, as you know, nobody needs to have a case to make your life miserable. They just need to sue you. They could sue you for wearing green too often, and you're going to spend $100,000 on lawyer's fees before you get rid of that case. So, being able to assess those kinds of risks, sure, it helps a little bit here and there, but honestly, it doesn't really move the needle that much. And I think on the flip side, the tech background helps all the time. There are few companies that can't benefit in a really material, significant way from a tech transformation, first off, but also that builder mentality that you talk about of thinking about, how do I approach this problem objectively? How do I revisit my own decisions and objectively verify, did they work or not? Did I do the right thing or not? Those are hugely important to making sure that you don't just kind of come up with a theory of the case that you then stick to until the company is bankrupt. Because the skills that make you successful as a lawyer and that make you successful in business, I think, are quite different. I remember in law school, this one time we've talked a bit about this, that I sort of finished undergrad at a young age and I hadn't really, had any fun. And then I get to law school when you're supposed to really hunker down and be serious. And that's when I was kind of like, I wasn't that interested in it. And I wasn't studying all that hard. I wasn't that engaged. So I know bad timing of when to do that. But I remember this one time I show up for class and I hadn't read the case that we were supposed to read. And I got called on and I said to the professor, I was like, I haven't read the case. He's like, "I don't care. Answer the question anyway." And I'm like, "Excuse me?" He's like, "Bullshit me. This is going to happen in real life. You're going to go up at some point before a judge who's going to ask you a question that you don't know the answer for, and you got to learn how to think on your feet and come up with something better than I'm sorry, I'm not prepared today." And so I think that he was right that is a skill. Obviously, you don't want to commit malpractice and make up case law that doesn't exist or something like that. But you do need to, as a lawyer, show this very high level of conviction, even if somebody asks you a question that you've never in your life thought about and you don't actually know the answer to. Part of what will make you successful is to stand there in front of the court and say, "Oh, well, I mean, without question, the answer is X." And just to say that as though it's written in stone. How could you not know that when, you have no idea? That will serve you well, at least in litigation. And that does not serve you well in management. of a business.
Confidently wrong.
Yeah, exactly.
It's to say, I don't want anybody to think going to law school has no benefits or that being a lawyer inevitably is going to be a miserable existence. Obviously, you and I didn't love that portion of it, but you learn a lot and there are analytical skills you learn when you go to law school. But I think there's a missing piece, at least in the United States. And I think internationally abroad, there's other ways to go about this, but there's less practitioner and there's too much professor. And I think that is an interesting thing also about building businesses and just business in general, which is the more practitioner you are, the better off you are generally. The more professor you are, the worse you are. And you see this a lot on LinkedIn or wherever, which is the confidently wrong, or even if maybe they're right, which is the people who stand up and they give you the frameworks and the mental models, and this is what you do. And then you ask them, oh, have you ever done that? Well, no, I'm a professor at this university, or even worse, I'm a YouTube star.
Yeah, I have a blog.
I have a blog. That's all stuff. And it's not to say that you can't learn something, then teach it. We need teachers. But being a practitioner is really important. And so one thing you mentioned that I thought was important to highlight was this idea of teaching your team, everybody in your company, how you make money. I say this a lot. I feel like it's missed, lawyers especially. And I was 100% at fault of this when I was a partner in a law firm, not fundamentally understanding how the firm made money. And then being surprised when I did something they didn't like. And I think that is fundamentally important. It always blows my mind how many people just have no idea what a P&L is, or like how to even read a basic financial chart, right? And so my curious to you is, how have you helped your team learn those skills?
It's, in my view, this is really fundamental to building a healthy workplace. And that doesn't mean I've always gotten it right. In fact, I will say this was particularly a struggle for me at High Impact. We had a big team of artists. We had medical illustrators, we had 3D animators, and artists, I found, personality wise, don't generally like to think a lot about the financials. They want to make art. They want to make something that's fantastic. And that's a great starting place, but we were not a social club for artists. We were not making this for fun. We were ultimately a business that needed to deliver profits for investors. And that's a hard reality for people to sometimes come to terms with. I did find that it was a little harder there to get them to sort of marry both of these things are true. You do need to make great art. I don't want you to make garbage. And yet also, if you're just making great art and it's not what the client asked for, or it's not, helping their case, or it's, taking you 5 times longer than we thought it was going to take, all of those things are going to interfere with the business. And eventually, if we just let that go as a runaway train, there will be no business. And so I think there's kind of that layer. But the second layer that I think is true across almost every business is that you have to be careful that your frontline employees almost always are aware of your gross margin and not your net margin. And that is a huge, huge risk to leave unaddressed, in my view. So if you flip burgers for a living, and that you signed the order form for the burgers that came in the other day when the guy had delivered them, and you saw that it was $400 for that box, and there were 100 of them, so $4. I'm making up numbers. That's not a good number, actually. Let's just say it was 200 or whatever you use. But let's just say they can figure out, you got a $2 cost basis. You sold it for $8. Oh my God, they make $6 on every burger. Why am I not making more money? This place sucks. And so you can get this really negative morale very quickly because everyone figures out your gross margin or close to it very quickly. What they're not thinking about is, how much was the rent on that, prime location in the mall that they have, and how much of each burger does that eat up? How about the fact that, hey, that benefits package that you think is not too bad, maybe it could be better, whatever else, costs a fortune. And, all the lights on the signs and in the building, turns out that electric bill is huge. You're in the middle of the desert. Did you know how much your air conditioning costs every month? And so as you start to go through all those things, and insurance and all these really boring things, lawyers' fees, and, your software systems, your point of sale system, all these kinds of things add up way, way, way more than people typically think. And, it's not uncommon to see businesses that have, a 75, 80% gross margin and a 10% margin at the bottom line. And yet it's really dangerous, in my view, to leave people, again, they always will see that 75, 80%. In fact, they'll usually overstate it because they usually forget one or two of the items that using my burger analogy.
Onions.
Exactly. They forget the onions, and that, that they go bad quickly and they throw away a lot of onions or something like that. So they're still going to underestimate that, but they're going to be a lot closer on that. And they just completely don't see how much all the other stuff adds up. And yet they also feel it when those things go away. If you have a dysfunctional HR department and nobody can answer your question about why your paycheck looks the way it does, you're going to be really pissed off, but it costs money to have people who can answer that question and make sure that it's correct and that it shows up on the right day and all of those things. And so helping people sort of bridge that gap mentally, that, look, I don't need you to worry about this. This isn't your problem, but I do need you to be aware of it. And maybe saying this isn't your problem isn't even the right thing, because ultimately selling those burgers has to fund all this other stuff in order for us to all do this, and no, it's not that we're making 80 cents on a dollar. It's nowhere near that point. So I find that that's a really critical thing to get people at least roughly in line with. And if you're a private company, you can't necessarily share all the details of your financials, which makes it, it sort of sucks that you have to talk a lot in qualitative terms instead of quantitative terms. And this comes back to then making sure that people trust you, because that's all they're going to have to go on. They're not going to get to see the financials. And so you do need to build the trust for them to hear you say that and hopefully come away understanding, oh, he's telling the truth. We do need to slightly improve our efficiency or we're in a bad spot, even though it looks like I'm, getting underpaid.
I think what's also important in that analogy is sometimes you can have employees, teams, senior executives who are great at pushing one thing that you sell, one product you sell, without any concept of whether that's good for the company or not, right?
Exactly.
It could be SaaS, it could be whatever. But I think, to your point, if you can train people to be curious and inquisitive, and just fundamentally when they start any job or go into their job or at their job now, just ask, like, how do we actually make money? Like, is it better if I sell the burger or should I be selling the milkshakes, right? What matters?
Well, and I think another thing that's interesting about that, because that's true of just about every business, that you have these areas of the business that are more profitable than other areas. But I think wherever you see that, it's indicative of a misalignment between the value perception and the pricing model, or at least how you're going to market. And you're never going to get that to be 100% efficient and accurate. But it's worthwhile to be cognizant of, why are we struggling so much to be profitable in this area? Why does the public not see the value that we are providing when this is actually an expensive service that we're providing? It's not easy to do. And you probably need to educate your customers and clients when that happens, but you also need to rethink a little bit. Should we be doing something differently? Because they don't see the value in this.
Now you're talking a little bit of go-to-market, marketing compounded with sales, how the end customer and buyer views what you do, the value you provide. I think in the age of AI that we're in, especially in the legal industry, there's a big push on efficiencies and who's doing the work and why. And it's been interesting to watch the discourse, because I think there is a lack of understanding of the value you provide. Lawyers have often too much focused on the inputs, the hours they're billing, versus what are you actually, the end user, the consumer, the corporate, whatever it might be, getting out of this, right? And that is really important in how you evaluate your business. For you, in the businesses that you've worked on, how have you managed that go-to-market? How have you gotten the end buyer to see the value in what you provide so you can charge the prices you want?
Well, for one thing, I don't always. And it's important sometimes to just recognize, sometimes you have an area of the business that you will not get people to see the value and align those two things. And that's probably an area of the business that either you exit it or you just simply de-emphasize it. And so we had that, every business I worked in actually has had areas of the business where you just kind of let it go a little bit, and people get really surprised. Like, why are we not selling more of this? And it's like, because people don't see the value. care that much. If they want to buy it at a price that makes sense for us, we'll do it. If they want to have a conversation about it, I'm happy to talk to your customer and explain. And I've had those conversations with people to say, listen, here's the deal. So one of the challenges we faced actually at High Impact was all of this generative AI tech came out while I was CEO there, and none of it was really applicable to our business. We couldn't use it. Everybody has seen the pictures where, you try and generate an image of a person's hand and they get 6 fingers and 3 thumbs out of those 6, something weird, whatever. Well, if you figure you're trying to do like a medical illustration, it gets significantly worse. My favorite example was one of the platforms that we were testing early on to see how well it could do our kind of work. I think I was trying to get it to do like a blood clot in the brain illustration, something like that. And it literally drew one of the blood vessels in the brain as a penis. I had to just pull it up at a board meeting because we were talking about where are we going? How are we going to use AI tech? And they weren't believing me. I think that really it's not anywhere near usable. And so I just kind of said, I'm just going to put this Rorschach drawing up on the screen. You can all see whatever you want to see. If one of you sees a child playing in a park, good for you. I see something else. I can tell you, even as somebody who doesn't have a degree in anatomy or, medical illustration, I'm pretty certain that's not where that part of the anatomy is. And everybody just erupted with laughter. And they're like, and I was like, okay, that's the actual output. Here was the prompt. Here's the output.
Right.
So anyway, going back to what this meant for the business was, developing art at a time when all of a sudden there was this new amazing tool for developing art quickly, cheaply, really easily for every layperson. And it immediately devalued the perception of what we were doing in the market. And at a time when there was also a lot of inflation happening for our team. So, people's rent was going up, their food prices were going up, everything else. So we had all this cost pressure of people wanting higher pay and us trying our best to keep up as much as possible with it. And yet we also were facing this downward pressure on revenue because people simply didn't view our work as being as valuable, despite the fact there was no use of AI happening behind the scenes. We couldn't use it. So what they saw happen was we started to kind of de-emphasize a little bit of how much that kind of work is what we were selling. And we focused our efforts for a while a little bit more on other parts of the business where there wasn't quite that same disconnect. And I was happy to talk to clients. And again, you sort of get them around to it, but it's not uncommon that you have a disconnect.
Talking about generative AI and your team and the art team and tools that are disrupting, brought up a question I had for you. If your employee, senior executive on your team, whomever, comes to you and says, hey, I saw XYZ article. I've been playing with these tools. They're getting pretty good, and it feels like it's my job that they're going to replace. What do you say to somebody like that? And I guess the inverse is, even if you're a junior, you're in college, you're just out of your first job, how do you find success going forward with all this new technology coming?
That's a great question. I think, first off, the person who identifies that in the first place rarely has their job at risk. That if you're the person who is finding these ways to build the mousetrap better, faster, et cetera, you're going to have a seat at the table. You probably are going to move up a role in the company, and it's going to enable us to deliver more work. And so, yeah, it's rarely the person who finds that who should be worried about their job, although they are often. It's also not that common that really the broader team should even be that, at least not in the companies I've run. It's generally, how am I going to use this to grow rather than how am I going to use this to cut?
I think you brought up something I want to touch on with you, which is the idea of growth versus cutting for success. At all your roles, you've managed to grow the business. I mean, that's really what has made you so successful. And I think too often, especially in senior leadership, but maybe as you're growing or an entrepreneur, while yes, you want to be lean and you don't want to just spend money willy-nilly, there's too much focus on reduction of costs instead of finding ways to grow. So I'm curious how you structured your management, your thought process. How did you go about that was successful?
All right. So going back to, we started this whole conversation about having a family, balancing your lifestyle, et cetera. Cutting a workforce, I don't sleep well. It makes me feel miserable. I've only had a couple times where I've actually had to, reduce headcount. And even then I've generally been able to manage through it with pretty minimal numbers on anything like that, but it feels terrible and I don't enjoy it. I don't want to do it. So selfishly, let's just start with that. Second, for a business, when you're reducing headcount, all of your morale will suffer significantly. You don't have to cut very many heads for a company with good morale to have terrible morale very, very quickly. So you can only be doing that if it's absolutely necessary. And what you're really doing when you do those reductions is you're slowing a descent. You're not working towards growth. And let's be real, there are industries, there are businesses where they start to simply decline, and that may become necessary. I don't particularly love working in a declining, dying industry or company. I don't think most people do, but it can be a reality. If you worked in the piano industry in the 1920s in New York, guess what? Record players started becoming abundant. The piano industry was going to decline. It just is what it is. And so there are plenty of industries where that's the case. I think, so keeping in mind, what are the goals that your investors have? It's usually going to be growth. So you're usually going to be better served to figure out what's not getting us there. What do we need to change? And then look at your current team and figure out who can we move into what positions to get us on track. And that may mean, in fact, I'll be really blunt, it usually will mean moving some folks into positions that they're not a great fit for, but where you can work with it. And most of the time, not all, if you can get somebody into a position where you're keeping somebody as part of the team, you're giving them an opportunity to grow their skill set, and you're going to invest in them a little bit more, that is going to be better for your overall outcome than cutting them and rehiring and bringing in new folks. And then everybody on the team is pissed off that, oh, you got rid of so-and-so, and then you brought this new person in. I don't like them, So if you can make it work and you can make those investments, then what you'll see is you're going to spend more time investing in that person for a while, but they will recognize that you made that investment, and you're going to have somebody who down the line is more loyal to the company, who's going to show you similar, good faith gestures when it comes. You're always going to need favors from people. There's going to be something that comes up off hours or whatever else. And those are the people who will come through for you.
I think too often, especially in the echo chamber of social media, in the founder entrepreneur world, you hear so much of the fire fast, move on. If they're not working, next person, right? And I think it's so interesting to me because there's like a total lack of acknowledgement that you just spent hiring that person. It's not a zero-sum game in the sense that you fire them and you just find somebody else and you replace them. You lose a lot. And the other important thing that you lose beyond the cost of finding that person and the person you're letting go, but it's this idea that I like of compound everything. People know compound interest over time, you make more money, et cetera, but it's actually the case with almost everything, especially domain expertise and expertise in your business. The longer you're there, the more you know, the better you can do your job. And I think it's a huge mistake to simply say that person can't do that job, or maybe they're not a perfect fit and I don't want to spend the time, because they have all this institutional knowledge that they've gained that they can leverage in the next thing. Now, as you said, that's not to say that every person fits every role, but I love to hear people like you who've found success remind our audience and remind entrepreneurs and business people that, people, if you give them the opportunity, actually tend to rise to the occasion more often than not.
That's right. And to the extent that, on this like fire first or hire slowly, fire quickly mentality, it depends on what we're talking about. So I think that there have been a handful of times where I find out somebody's doing something that's really dishonest. I fire them very quickly, and I lose no sleep over that. I like zero. And those are the kinds of things where you shouldn't keep somebody on board for a day if you've figured out that they're dishonest and that they're falsifying records, or they're doing something that's like a serious violation of your company's policies or beliefs, etc. Yeah, that's you can't get them out the door fast enough sort of a scenario. But when you're talking about somebody who's just kind of underperforming, but they're trying to do the right thing, if you've got somebody who's trying to do the right thing, who's willing to put in the effort, start thinking about what other roles might they be a better fit for within the company. How can you shift the role? You can usually get creative and find a way to get that person into something that's successful. Maybe it's only 90% as successful as what you were hoping for, but you'll probably get to a pretty good place. And again, going to those sort of other effects on the company, I don't think you build a good culture by being the kind of place where everybody knows that you're going to always, every year you're going to fire your bottom 20% of the company. You know, those kinds of workforces, you can only do that because you're buying people into the company at high prices. So it still has other impacts. You know, look, if you're going to pay $100,000 a year more than market for every role in the company, guess what? You can be total jerks about a million things and everyone will smile and pretend it's all okay because they're so highly compensated that they're just glad to still be there. But if you're trying to run a company that you can't afford to be overpaying everybody, you also can't afford to treat people like they're disposable.
I think there's always edge cases or reasons why you might do something, but I don't think there's enough discussion about the idea that you laid out, which is that if you give people the opportunity and you help them get where they can go, they can really do really well for you. Plus that there's second order consequences, third order consequences for a lot of the things that you do that impact your culture, impact morale, which impacts productivity, which is your bottom line.
Well, I think the other thing, I know especially sales managers hate for you to use the phrase luck or to the term luck ever, because they want to tell their team, no, there's none of it's luck. You got to work hard and whatever else. That's not true. There is in everything we do, there is a significant factor of luck, and there are significant unknowns. I think as a society, we tend to be overly focused on judging people's performance based on the outcomes. And look, that makes sense in a lot of ways, but hear me out. If, you know, there are times where, you know, somebody, to go back to my analogy of a blackjack game, there are times when somebody hits an 18 when there's a 5 showing and it just turns out that actually was the right move and they were going to lose. No, the odds don't say you should do it, but sometimes that will play out, and vice versa. You can do everything according to what you should do, and sometimes it just goes very badly for you. And we don't like those stories as much. You know, when somebody has a business that becomes wildly successful, we are quick to want to applaud them and talk about what a visionary they were, when sometimes the person just did a lot of things wrong and they got lucky that it all still came out right. And just as often, you've got the flip side. You have plenty of failed businesses and leaders who've had businesses go into decline who they just had a bad run of luck. Really, I mean, they did all the things they should have done given the information that was available. And even if you do all of those things, sometimes it's just not going to go your way. I think it's important for all of us, even though as a society, we're so bad at recognizing that. And nobody looks at a CEO from a failed company and says, wow, he was a really good CEO. Like you'll never hear that. And yet it exists. You know, there are people who did everything right and it didn't matter. The outcome still was a failure, and they should be applauded, but they won't be. But internally, you know, when you reflect on yourself and how you've done in your career, I think that's important. I don't think you can necessarily say it out loud and expect anybody to not like snicker. But that doesn't change the fact that if you feel you made the right moves, given the information you had available, you're going to sleep a little better at night. And that's sometimes you just got to do your best and accept that there's a lot of chance in life.
There's two ideas there that I like to talk about and remind myself, frankly, about, which is one is this idea of luck surface area. The more opportunities you put yourself out there, the more chance at luck you have. And that's networking, that's meeting people, that's acting, that's trying. That's really important. And I don't think there's enough effort put into putting yourself out there. That's really about getting luck. Mm-hmm. It is lucky. People don't like to talk about it. I agree with you, but so much of it is luck. And so if you don't put yourself out there, your luck surface area is really small.
That's right. So this goes back to you made a reference to batting averages. I've used card games. If the math is that 1 out of 100 is going to work out and you've made a whole lot of bets, then you're going to have a few that work out.
I also think what's important in that idea is that success isn't that one time it just happened. The Zuckerberg syndrome, sometimes it does work out for you the first thing you do. But
right,
for the most part, it's all the work you put in for 20 years to get to that point that nobody sees, right? They don't see that. They just see the shining star exiting out of a company or whatever it might be. They don't see all the work that got put into that. And which is why I always stress, and part of the reason I like this podcast is talking about the journey that got you where you are is as important as the end result. So it's been fantastic talking to you today. I think our audience can pull so many good nuggets away from your journey, your experiences, and apply it to their careers and futures. And I'd like to end these podcasts by asking, is there anything that you'd like the audience to take away from today from you?
Well, I suppose there were enough areas where I either talked about regret or, that when things don't go well, that you can probably sense I'm not your general like optimist, rah person. And yet I think what you said just nailed it, which was the importance of the journey. Most of us will have moderate success if we do the right things, and if we do them enough times. And if you find ways to work with people you like to work with, do things you like to do, challenge yourself in ways that you like to be challenged, maybe you never become a billionaire. Maybe the startup that you had in your head never turns out to be great. But that journey is what life is. That's the thing that will ultimately give you fulfillment, satisfaction, happiness. Try to find that balance and play the odds where you can play them, and don't beat yourself up too much about it if some of those things just don't go the way that you hoped. Enjoy the journey.
That is a fantastic way to end today. Thanks so much for coming on Do More, Be Better, John.
Sal, thank you for having me. This is awesome.
Can't wait till the next time.